Today we're gonna do one of my favorite pastimes, complain about Star Wars. Now it seems the popular thing to do nowadays is to kinda destroy Disney's Star Wars' universe so far. Especially after the recent bombs of The Last Jedi and Solo. Although, to be fair, critically I kind of like both those films, but I do have to admit that when you compare it to what they were supposed to be, the stories we saw in the expanded universe, and I bring that word up, and some of you are going to click off this video almost immediately, but when we look at where things could have been, at least a lot of questions that I can't necessarily answer, but I think are worth exploring. I hope you enjoy.
Jump cut. So this is a topic I like to think I know pretty well. I grew up with the Star Wars prequels while they were still in theaters, and I watched the original cuts of episodes 4, 5, and 6 on VHS, the way they ought to be watched. I also consumed a copious amount of Star Wars video games, books, and merchandise, to the point where I can proudly call myself a Star Wars nerd. I grew up in an era where Star Wars was exploding from a brand perspective, though in truth that started long before I was born, particularly around the time of 1991's Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn, which became a New York Times bestseller and spawned a trilogy of books so popular that they jump-started Star Wars' expanded universe, or EU, which in turn served as a shining example to other multimedia brands' shared universes, particularly Warcraft and Magic the Gathering. To date, Star Wars has sold over 160 million books alone, which is over half of the population of the United States, and spans video games and comics as well. Now, with any movie or TV show nowadays, especially science fiction or fantasy ones, the idea that your property can spawn successful tied-in content in other art mediums and other merchandise seems pretty standard, with the notion that this tie-in content can be as great or better than the original is now sort of a gold standard that, only a few have achieved, and the success of Star Wars as a brand is a testament to this. Star Wars started as a blockbuster movie trilogy in the 70s and 80s, gaining a reputation for its groundbreaking special effects and simple storytelling. For many, Star Wars was their first foray into science fiction because of this very reason. It's very accessible. The original 3 films are one of the rare cases of movies that appeal to virtually every demographic, which is a difficult balancing act that every film afterward would fail to get right. With the prequel trilogy being too immature at times, i.e. every scene with Jar Jar Binks in The Phantom Menace, and inappropriate for children at others, like when Anakin slaughtered younglings in Revenge of the Sith. And the sequel trilogy is struggling to find the right balance of comedy and drama, and it made sense for what Star Wars was. It was the first blockbuster movie franchise, defining what modern blockbusters are, and as such, its films have one goal in mind: make as much money as possible. Which is why the films try to cater to everybody. And you have to admit, they don't have a lot of time to do that. There's a few ways these films can go. Number 1. You can make something timeless, like the original trilogy. 2. You can make a confusing mess that doesn't cater to anybody, and barely works as a film, like the prequels. Or 3. You can make something that is perfectly fine, but is so dull that it doesn't leave a lasting impact, like the sequel trilogy. Hence, you bring out the niche products. The first big foray into this was the before-mentioned Heir to the Empire, which came out at a time where there hadn't been a Star Wars film in 9 years, and we have to wait another 8 years for another one. It was a period of time where Star Wars was dipping its feet into multimedia, having already produced the Ewoks movies and cartoon, the Star Wars Holiday Special, multiple comics, a toy line, and even a few video games, but it wasn't everywhere just quite yet. In fact, Star Wars was dying, with its merchandise being relatively hard to get and obscure at this time. Heir to the Empire told an original tale in the Star Wars universe after Episode 6, centering on the remnants of the Galactic Empire and the continued tales of Luke, Leia, and Han from the original trilogy. And it was a smash hit, becoming a New York Times bestseller and served to launch the entire Star Wars expanded universe, introducing Star Wars not only to a new generation through its stories, but also to new reinvigorated product lines. Heir to the Empire is so revered, Disney recently brought its main antagonist, Grand Admiral Thrawn, back into canon. And when we look at the Star Wars expanded universe, it allowed Lucasfilm to do a few major things. 1. It allowed them to focus on niche audiences, audiences. This meant that Star Wars could make books and games aimed both for teenagers, small children, and adults through different products, instead of trying to cater to everyone through the same movie. 2. It allowed them to try out every story they wanted at relatively no risk. Now, there are awful Star Wars books and video games out there, but because they had the Star Wars name, they're always destined to at least break even, with some of its stories surpassing the quality of the original trilogy, allowing the franchise to regularly bring Hugo and Nebula award-winning authors into the mix. It also helped that the books and comics were relatively cheap to make. They weren't exactly putting $100 million into each of these projects. And 3, it allowed them to create new product opportunities elsewhere, selling new merchandise and toys. And that third one's a big one for the popularity of Star Wars and why it's so valuable as a brand. As a result of Lucasfilm being able to mass produce hundreds of Star Wars stories, they create a backlog of quality scenarios and characters that Disney has full reign to use. But despite the fact that Disney is committed to making one Star Wars film a year, they have yet to properly use virtually any of this good content, preferring to start from scratch. I do put an asterisk there because the Star Wars Rebels team has tried to dig deep into the archives, but the film studio has not. Now here's why.
It's incompetence. It's just incompetence. You know, I guess Disney just doesn't like reading books.
Hear me out. Let's look at where Disney brought Star Wars, and then let's see where they could have gone, and then you ask me if it makes any sense. The sequel trilogy mainly follows Rey and Kylo Ren, otherwise known as Ben Skywalker, with Rey being a desert scavenger who finds herself brought into a conflict between the rebooted Rebellion, renamed the Resistance, and the rebooted Empire, named the First Order, with Ben being the son of Leia Organa and Han Solo from the previous films. Ben turned to the dark side, leading the rebooted Sith, who are called the Knights of Ren. It all sounds pretty fanficky now, doesn't it? When we look at them as characters, Rey is a blank slate, not really having any desires or motivations other than to know where she came from, being abandoned at a young age, and where her place is in the galaxy. Kylo's motivations change every movie, with him wanting to kill his family in the first one, to wanting to kill the rest of his family in the second one, and having this desire to rule the galaxy. Now, what's he gonna do with the galaxy once he has it? I don't know. He seems very much like a dog chasing his tail, which in my opinion is pretty lame, although Kylo is the deepest character in these new movies, as he struggles with conflicting desires to want to follow in his grandfather's footsteps, Darth Vader. He also wants to rid himself of his past, as it binds him to the light side of the Force, which the wrinkled Supreme Leader Snoke told him was a bad thing, although we never really get enough of Kylo's backstory to really get where he's coming from, other than a rush scene in The Last Jedi, where Luke Skywalker, for a second, thinks about killing him. But for the most part, Kylo Ren is evil because he's evil. The plot needs him to be. The new trilogy has been criticized as such for lacking not only basic character and world building, i.e. we go from the New Republic existing from 1 second in The Force Awakens to it being only a few ships in The Last Jedi with no explanation, but also basic screenwriting. Things just sort of happen and they seem to make sense thematically, but at the end of the day they just sort of leave you sad and confused. Like they didn't have a plan when they made these movies, and they didn't know where to take these characters or how to advance the Star Wars universe. And that last point's a big one. I'm definitely not the only one who noticed this. It just seems like Disney is just recycling the old Star Wars content we've seen before in the original trilogy and are trying to rearrange it in ways that will garner the same box office returns. Except for their spin-off films like Solo, where they just say fuck it and hope whatever inexperienced indie director they hired that year comes up with something crazy enough to actually work. So far they're going 1-to-1 there. And they do this while they've been sitting on this gold mine of over 40 years of stories that already work. So let's explore what they could have gone with, if they adapted the expanded universe verbatim. Now, the arc they probably would have gone with is called Legacy of the Force, which takes place 40 years after Episode 6. We follow one male lead and one female lead in the story as well, one named Jaina Solo, one named Jason Solo or Darth Caedus. They are twins, and are the children of Leia Organa and Han Solo from the previous movies. This arc takes place a few years after the Yuuzhan Vong War, a devastating interspecies conflict between the known galaxy and invaders from outside of it, who have a strong warrior culture and utilize flesh-based technology. The Vongese have been driven out, but at great costs. And as a result, the world is broken, and the Skywalker family is no exception. Jason and Jaina lost their brother Anakin in the conflict, and the death shattered their family. And Jason disappeared, falling susceptible to a Sith who offered him salvation. And he reappeared years later to join the Galactic Alliance, which is what the Republic reorganized into. Jason throws a coup, and in his rise to power, he kills Boba Fett's daughter, as well as the wife of Luke Skywalker. Luke and his new Jedi Order go into hiding, and Jaina finds herself on a collision course with Jason, horrified at how far gone her brother is, and grappling with the fact that at this point he is irredeemable. She trains with Boba Fett and learns how to take him down, and she does. While that might be grossly oversimplified, there's a lot more to like in Legacy of the Force than in the Disney Star Wars movies. For one, Jason and Jaina have clear personalities that don't change at the convenience of the story, and we know why they're doing what they're doing at all times. Jaina is on a path to kill her brother because, as his twin sister, she knows his weaknesses more than anyone else does. Jason wants to bring order to the galaxy by any means necessary, and his motivations are altruistic, although warped by the dark side. He also feels that the dark side was the only way that he could achieve this, as he saw a vision of a Dark Lord ruling over the galaxy after Anakin's death, and if you know anything about Force visions, kind of magical, you should take these very seriously. So his thought process was that the only way to prevent the galaxy from falling into the hands of another emperor was to become that emperor. But even without that plot point, Jason still works as a tragic character who is blinded by his own ambition to the point where it warps him into something hideous. He's not so one-note as Kylo Ren, who is just evil because he wants to be evil, and because some scraggly old cult leader told him to kill his parents. But it is impossible not to draw similarities between Jason Solo and Kylo Ren, particularly his hate of the Skywalkers. Jason fundamentally disagrees with Luke Skywalker in his often direct interventions in the galaxy, and he left the Jedi Order after it got him and his brother killed, an ordeal that led to Jason's capture and torture. Jason also believed that the same interventions that Luke were doing was the reason why the Jedi went extinct in the first place in the prequel trilogy, and he was kind of right. Jason's altruism gets him hurt, and he loses faith in Luke and the Jedi way. Afterwards, Jason's path just gets darker, as in place of Luke as a mentor, he found a Sith. Kylo, on the other hand, doesn't like Luke because he almost tried to kill him, and used that as an excuse to murder the fledgling Jedi Order on the suggestion of Supreme Leader Wrinkleface. Kylo's backstory is like what you'd get if you shoved a couple of Yuzhan Vong novels and half the Legacy of the Force collection into a paper shredder, and then you rearrange them into a script, which is what I think J.J. Abrams tried to do. It really does come off as someone who read the back of the Star Wars novel and was forced to make their own original tale based off of just that would make, which might not be that off the mark. Check out this interview with The Force Awakens director J.J. Abrams with IO9. It became clear that if we would adhere to the expanded universe, it would have been a very tricky thing to navigate. It wasn't even clear that what is canon in the expanded universe, and I don't think the vast majority of Star Wars fans ever read a Star Wars novel. We can't try to please every fan of that universe first. You have to try and tell the best version of a Star Wars movie. I thought, if ideas that come up feel like they overlap and feel like they work, great. But we can't adhere to something that is as vast as the EU, and frankly is less known than the films. This was Abrams' excuse for axing the EU and starting fresh. Problem was, JJ didn't actually have a better idea as to how to fill the gaps in between episodes 6 and 7. And as a result, his versions of things come off as vastly inferior to the 40 years of stories crafted by multiple writers above his caliber, even if there were plot holes and at times it didn't make any sense. But it also begged the question, if JJ had free reign to all these stories, especially Legacy of the Force, why didn't he steal the best bits? And then it hit me. Some of JJ's schedule probably didn't have time to read all of that material, and Kathleen Kennedy and Disney probably didn't either. They're business people, not Star Wars fans, despite what they're going to try to tell you. Might be fans of the movies, but probably not the books. And for me, this is frustrating because Disney is mishandling Star Wars. Solo's box office is the best example of that. They booted the EU and replaced it with something inferior. And now, some people only think that Star Wars can be some version of the Empire versus the Rebels, that it's not capable of new and interesting stories set in the Star Wars world, when in fact, it has been telling interesting stories outside that paradigm for years. Just none of them have been blockbuster movies. You have to really question why Disney decided to go with a knockoff cross between Darth Vader and watered down Jason Solo, the character of Kylo Ren, when Jason Solo was an interesting character not only because he had a relatable and rational motivation, but the fact that he has to fight his very own twin sister is interesting in of itself. That is such a tricky and complex relationship that a pair of just competent writers, they don't even have to be good writers, could have brought to life in a way that brought Star Wars to its next level of storytelling, that brought something different to Star Wars that we haven't seen before on screen. Jason Solo could have been Star Wars' first sympathetic villain, and there wouldn't be any big emperor to fight, just someone who's fallen from grace and still trying to do good through their own warped logic. And it would have allowed Disney to explore the more volatile nature of the Star Wars universe as a whole, in a way that didn't feel like they were rehashing the last 6 movies. Why did Disney go with the First Order, which is an imitation empire, when they had the Galactic Alliance to work with, which was essentially an evolution of the New Republic? And they still would have had the Empire remnants to work with, which were a natural evolution of the fallen empire we see at the end of episode 6. Why did they go with Rey, who we know nothing about and has no motivations and goals outside of knowing what's going on, when they had Jaina, who was a reluctant heroine who is not only trained and well seasoned, but has to kill her very own twin brother because of what he deemed necessary destruction to not only the universe but to members of his own family, who have become casualties of his own ambition? Why make the new Jedi Order a scraggly bunch of 20-something when they had a sprawling temple at Yavin 4 and a whole academy they could have brought to life, brimming with cool Jedi characters that they could have included to make the universe feel more lively? Why make Supreme Leader Snoke present at all when the EU proved that you can tell interesting stories in the Star Wars universe without an Emperor present? And if they were going to go that route, why not make them characters interesting as, let's say, a Darth Plagueis, who orchestrated the fall of the Jedi, and of whom we thought was dead through the entire original 6-movie run? Or like Darth Vitiate, a Sith Lord who lived for thousands of years. Why make Snoke a mystery box that served only to poke fun at the idea of an evil galactic overlord, when there were countless better examples Star Wars had at its disposal that had yet to debut on screen? Disney didn't have to tell every story it had at its disposal 100% true to the source material, but it should have mined the EU for its best parts before it half-heartedly and drunkenly made its own Star Wars. And this is why people think Star Wars is creatively bankrupt, because George Lucas got overambitious with his sequels and fell on his face, and as a result, Disney was only comfortable with making something it thought fans would recognize, the original trilogy. And it frustrates me that Disney chose this route while commissioning spin-off films that fall into more or less the same trends, when it has a goldmine of battle-tested stories and concepts at its feet. Disney inherited a multimedia empire, one that it's keen on filling with its own TV shows, books, video games, and comics, but has no idea what made any of that multimedia good or effective on their own, outside the unquestionable success of the first 3 movies. The original trilogy also served as the base for all of Star Wars' good multimedia, and not the sum of their parts. Right from the gate, when they canceled Star Wars 1313, it was apparent Disney didn't know what they were doing, as they canceled a highly anticipated game over technicality. And to this date, Disney executives cannot comprehend why story-based Star Wars games have always done pretty well, while garnering loyal, dedicated followings. In place of it, they gave us a generic, safe, and marketable, easy-to-make Battlefield ripoff from EA, one that no one will revisit. It's strange, because Disney wants to do original ideas in Star Wars. It wants to give new and interesting writers a chance to shine, but they either hire creatively bankrupt directors and writers, or are too restrictive that by the time their multimedia reaches us, it's a drab and polished down skeleton of a product. So what ends up happening is that we're left with fine okay creatives that are faced with the task of outdoing tried and true stories we've already consumed, stories that are better. And I think Disney knows that these old stories are better, hence the reintroduction of Thrawn into Star Wars canon, and the creative liberty that the Star Wars Rebels team have gotten. And I'm not saying that the EU is perfect, but it has a few gems that I don't think should be ignored. Legacy of the Force, Jedi Academy, Darth Revan's arcs, The Rule of Two, and Heir to the Empire, to name a few. I think the lesson of the story is to not wipe the slate clean and start from scratch when you have a few perfectly good diamonds that you could fix up with minimal effort, and I do mean minimal. Abrams and Disney cry complicated when the best EU stories are as simple as they get, and have already stuck with general readers. These are New York Times best-selling stories, and AAA video games we're talking about here, not fringe products. It's really not all that hard to edit and modify stories that already exist and already work, and have worked for decades, especially when you yourself don't actually have a plan.
I want to end this video by kind of defending Disney's rationale for ending the EU, because there's not all negatives for that decision. What it allowed them to do is start over and perhaps tell some of the elements of the stories they already had there more effectively, basically giving them a second chance at life. However, does this mean they should have started over completely from scratch? Nah, I still don't believe that. But again, this is just my opinion. I bet you guys have yours, and I'd love to hear them in the comments below. Until next time, I'll see ya.